All right, we should be on YouTube here in just 1 second. Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for coming by tonight. I've got a great guest on the channel for the stream. Oh, and I didn't mute my stream in honor of Settlers Lament. There we go. All right. So thanks for coming by, guys. I've got Settlers Lament on tonight. He's got a great channel. I'm sure most of you have already seen it, but if you haven't, you should definitely check it out. The links are below. Thanks for coming on, Settler.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I mean, I imagine most people here already subscribed, but if you aren't, check it out, youtube.com/settlerslament.
Yeah, he definitely makes some great videos. Actually, I think my favorite video of yours, funny enough, because you have a lot of great discussions and stuff on the channel. But I think my favorite videos was actually the Onward review, like the one,
yeah.
the like Onward is actually like super reactionary and based.
Yeah, that was interesting. That was actually a sponsored video. Someone gave me money to do that one. And when I had a guy messaging me telling me that this Pixar movie that came out this year was super epic and based and stuff, I was pretty skeptical. But when I watched it, it's definitely there. I mean, I'm sure it's accidental. I doubt that that our guys are secretly working at Pixar, but I guess that's just horseshoe theory.
Well, I think I think it's one of those. Art can reveal things whether it means to or not, and I think that's always I think that's often what we get anymore when we see reactionary themes in art. At this point, it's often people just accidentally telling the truth at times. But I did see someone comment on that movie, like, is this Ted Kaczynski's Disney movie? Which I got a good chuckle out of.
Yeah. But yeah, it was a really interesting film. I mean, I don't know, all modern film is just awful. I mean, I'm not even sure if I would show that movie to my kids. I don't know. I guess I'd have to do an edit of it because there's at least one scene I would not want my children to watch.
Yeah.
But it's pretty cool. I don't know. I'm blackpilled on a lot of things. There's a reason why Lament is half of my name. But the entire film industry is just so awful. We've seen that, especially in the past couple of days with Netflix. But I don't know. It's just all so bad.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll get into some of that absolutely with current events
Speaking of which, if you haven't canceled your Netflix yet, you probably should be on a watch list.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's. You don't wonder, how that gets made and how it gets pushed and how even in the face of the backlash, they're not even going to bother to blink at this one. So yeah, that's getting harder and harder to justify. But did want to get started with a little bit of an introduction. I usually ask people, just because I think a lot of times they don't necessarily go into it on their channels sometimes. I was interested in how you kind of got interested in, being online, the right-wing YouTube space, maybe the NRX type, ideas. How did you first encounter that, and what got you started on YouTube?
Well, yeah, I was always one of those weird kids, as I think is relatively common with people in these spheres growing up. But yeah, so I mean, I was obsessed with politics from a relatively young age. And that started with basically American-style boomer conservatism. I talked about this in one of my somewhat recent videos. It's kind of funny. I was like a teenage neocon, and all my teachers didn't really know how to answer my my cringe boomercon talking points that I got from American talk radio or whatever. But eventually, over time, just my sort of obsession with politics got me to looking into various political stuff all over the internet, which eventually got me into the sort of YouTube political stuff. Initially, it was the sort of stuff that I watched was the boomer conservative stuff. But the first thing that really sort of introduced me into the sort of younger, more sort of distant spheres was Sargon, the notorious radicalizer.
Mm-hmm.
Because I did watch lots of stuff on YouTube before that, but he was the first one that was sort of in the younger sphere of YouTubing stuff. So I watched him back I can't remember when exactly. It was after Gamergate was already like mostly finished, or at least before like the before Gamergate was a big thing. But that's kind of what introduced me to that. And then after watching Sargon, I experienced tons of different stuff, lots of other sort of skeptic channels, and I also after that I watched sort of more distant channels. I watched a lot of the alt-right stuff back when that was a big thing. I was never a part of the alt-right or sided with them really or anything. But when they were a big phenomena back in like 2016 or 2015 or whatever, I saw that all blow up. So yeah, so that was interesting. And then I sort of Dave is what introduced me to the sort of traditionalist stuff, and yeah, that's that's sort of where I got into like Mencius Moldbug and that type of stuff.
Yeah, I actually had a pretty similar path. I was one of those. My grandma was one of those QVC watchers and would buy like random things for Christmas. And she got me one of those hats that has a radio in it because that's how cool I was. And so I walked around my house listening to conservative talk radio. My parents weren't political at all, so you can't blame them. It was entirely my fault. But I did the same thing. I listened to a lot of conservative talk radio. Had the Neocon, BoomerCon set up very, very young. I was trying to get George Bush reelected in college, and so watching guys like Sargon when things kind of started to take a turn, that was a very similar route to me. And then I ran into to the distributist, and that introduced me to a lot of that stuff as well. So yeah, I have a pretty similar pathway to kind of these kind of circles.
Yeah, and I mean to be clear, like I make fun of the BoomerCon stuff, but I do still consider conservatives to be my people. I just my problem with mainstream conservatism is that's either sort of weak or it's ineffective. But I still believe that most conservatives and I fundamentally want the same sorts of things.
Oh yeah, absolutely. No, I'm right there with you. I always think, and that's one of my purposes, with doing what I'm doing, is I think of my journey, and I want to kind of leave the signpost for other people. That's part of why I set up the content I do. Is I'm often learning. I mean, I read Mencius Moldbug for the first time in I think February of this year, so it's relatively fresh for me. And so when I'm doing, this stuff, I am definitely have that audience in mind. Those are still absolutely our people for sure. Well, I wanted to go ahead, and our discussion for tonight was going to be on religion and the right. Obviously, we talk a lot about politics. We talk a lot about political power and how things work, especially with NRX and Moldbug and that kind of thing. But some of the stuff we don't always necessarily get to is kind of how religion interacts with that. I think, which is interesting because so often one of the key points of Moldbug, of course, is the cathedral and progressivism as a religion, as a decentralized atheist theocracy. But we often, when we're talking about opposing the left, we'll talk about how we don't like this policy or this degeneracy or this way they use power. But we oftentimes don't talk about kind of the religious aspect, the aspect of the soul that has been so deprived to so many people who are living in modernity. And so what I wanted to do today was kind of start approaching a conversation about how that works and how we should view that. So maybe you could give me your idea, when we talk about, of course, the left as a religion, we are then, then we talk about the culture war. We're also in some ways talking about a war of competing religions, competing ideas on that. Maybe you could talk a little bit about your feelings on religion and the role you think it might need to play in the right going forward as we're trying to counter a lot of the progressive narrative.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, religion, philosophy, tradition, all these words basically mean the same thing. These are just sort of arbitrary distinctions that we have made, especially in the United States, to sort of say that there's the old religions, which are bad and have no place in government, and there's the new religions, which are good and do have a place in government. These sorts of distinctions are mainly there just to get around the First Amendment, so the progressives can have their religious worldview indoctrinated everywhere, and the conservatives aren't allowed to do that at all. like even if you're an atheist, there's no reason at all to believe that just because progressives are right on the God question, that they're right on any other of the questions. There's many things that progressives believe that are clearly religious viewpoints. They're based on they're based on some sort of philosophical concept. They're not based on any sort of objective empirical reality. One of the best examples of this is, of course, the transgender stuff, where as much as they pretend this is scientific, it's clearly based on a non on a concept that cannot be proved through science on what you is. This isn't something that you can prove with the scientific method. Another similar example would be the concept of equality. This is a moral concept. This isn't something that you can prove. But these are very fundamental tenets of progressivism, and it's that's basically it.
No, I think you're right. I think they're, of course, we know they're absolutely trying to claim, moral preferences as scientific facts. That's nothing new for the left. And I think as we watch them continue to push on those tenuous connections between science and the agenda that they want to move forward, I think we're starting to see a break from a little bit of that. Don't get me wrong, they're going to continue to pretend that, like, no, really, you can give hormone blockers to a 7-year-old and there'll be no problem. They'll continue to push that kind of trash and pretend that there's scientific backing behind it. But I think increasingly the parts of the movement that were developed to exist in the environment, like you said, so much of progressivism's advantage and restating the way that it's formulated is to make it a non-religion and give it an advantage in an environment in which religion was, in theory, supposed to be somewhat curtailed from influencing government. Obviously, I think we would probably both agree that that's never going to happen. There's no such thing as a religious or morality-free government, and so that means that they're just kind of playing word games to make sure that they have that advantage. But I think more and more, while progressivism was developed and kind of outcompeted other religions in an environment where that had that decentralized, non-traditional advantage, where it didn't look like a normal religion, it didn't have a holy book, it didn't have a central church, and so it could pretend itself to be this magical secular thing that was separate and put and apart from religion and worldview and ideology. I think increasingly it's having to embrace the more radical parts of its movement because it's also needing more fuel for its moral claims. I think for a long time, progressivism got along on the material advancements, the improvements in quality of life, the technology that almost seemed kind of like a religious fulfillment of promises. But the more that has kind of not turned out to produce the utopia they envisioned, the more religious and base aspects of progressivism have had to come to the forefront to activate kind of the moral imperative with them.
Yeah, totally. I mean, the whole concept of a value neutral government is just ridiculous. It doesn't mean anything. The First Amendment exists in the United States because it was a compromise between many different competing competing forms of Christianity. But even then, it was not anything like what the modern progressives have sort of reinterpreted it to mean.
No, absolutely, and we can see, the continual push in directions that no person who ever conceived of the First Amendment would ever approve of, but because that founding story has been so built in to the rhetoric, they keep going back to it, pretending like the First Amendment was attempting to protect things like basically pedophilic content on Netflix, pretending like that's actually something that Thomas Jefferson or George Washington or Alexander Hamilton would have been interested in protecting, is obviously ridiculous. But that is continually the updating and reinterpretation of that amendment in order to allow that to continue. But what I think would be interesting for us to get into, since I think many people who have watched this and probably understand a little bit of what we're talking about from our previous videos, I think what might be interesting for us to get into is, so recognizing that the left operates in this manner, recognizing that what we're involved in is not just a war of discussion points. It's not the debate club. It's not just pulling out the best academic argument or citing enough statistics or papers. Understanding that it is more than just that, and we are really in a conflict of cultural values and basically religions. What should the right be thinking about when it comes to opposing the left religiously? What should we be looking to as we're trying to think strategies and ways to address what the left is doing, since we know what they are doing is fundamentally at base religious?
Well, yeah, I mean, just sort of as you said, you need to understand that this is it's not like, okay, so when I was younger, I remember, I mean, not much younger, I just mean like a couple of years ago, when I would get in political debates with people in real life, I'd always sort of go for the most inoffensive things I could think of. And I'd mention that I'm a Trump supporter or something like that, and especially in Canada, especially in a major urban center, this is a controversial opinion to hold. So I'd mention something like that, and people would flip out, and they'd be like, "Oh, why do you support Trump?" And I'd choose something really inoffensive. I'd usually say like, "Oh, I think his tax policy is good," or "I really like deregulation," or something like that. And even back then, when I was more normie of a conservative, those weren't really the main things that I was excited about from Trump. But I just knew those were the easiest things to defend because they're just sort of technocratic issues. Even though lefties will say that like right-wing tax policies are racist for whatever reason, they don't really believe that the same way that they think, say, right-wing immigration policies are racist. So it's a lot easier to sort of defend those things. And when I'd get into arguments with people, that's what I would try to make the argument about. But what you need to realize is it doesn't matter at the end of the day if you can beat a left winger in an argument about tax policy, because you still have two competing religious worldviews. Even if you do get them to agree with you, what it's basically like is saying, "Hey, you should vote for Satan because Satan has this really good tax policy." The problem is they still think it's Satan at the end of the day. Their entire like frame of reference needs to be changed for them to change that. This is actually something that St. John Henry Newman talked about in his most famous work, an essay on the development of doctrine. Just despite being referred to as an essay, it's a book. And it's very long. It's like, I mean, not very long, but it's much longer than what you'd think of as an essay. But he talks about this with Catholic versus Protestant arguments, where like people often get into debates on certain topics, and it doesn't really matter if you can like convince a Protestant that purgatory exists or something like that, because okay, they accept that. They're not really accepting the Catholic worldview, though. That's just one small aspect of it. The real problem is that you're operating from two fundamentally different frameworks.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think if the right is going to become, or at least our sphere of the right, kind of the dissident right, is going to become more than just a collection of people who realize that incremental victories in tax policy are not going to turn the ship around. I think one of the things that's probably essential to building is embracing and understanding that religious aspect of the discussion, which means we need to be forming and understanding and articulating, I think the religious worldview that we would like to see applied. Now, I think there is a loose coalition on the right in that generally the right is looking more for order. Like they're looking more for hierarchical structures. They're looking more for a return to what has been the more classical norm when it comes to male-female relations and that kind of thing. But I think where it breaks down is oftentimes we have a couple splits, and someone threw this up, so I'll put that one in there. But I think oftentimes we have some splits in the dissident right, in the kind of the right-wing sphere, because a lot of times we have some people, of course, who will be more traditional religious people. And then we'll also have some people who will say things like, well, Christianity was the problem. Like Christianity is what bred progressivism. It's what nurtured progressivism. It's what allowed it to take over. And basically progressivism is simply like just the worst form of Christianity. And if we want to oppose it, we can't start with Christianity again. We need something different. So they'll kind of do the pagan thing, or they'll come up, I'll see a number of different people say like, we need a new religion. Like that's something that you can just, start like a lawnmower. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on kind of how the right should maybe approach that, how they should handle that.
My response is you just need to stop being stupid. I shouldn't swear. But like, I could not possibly care less about these like the like 5 online pagan LARPers that exist. They're entirely irrelevant. The vast majority of pagans are progressives. It's just stupid. I know people would say that I'm guilty of the same sort of thinking because I'll say occasionally stuff like certain problems we have today are a direct result of the Protestant Reformation, which I do believe is the case. But I mean, 500 years is stretching it a bit, but 2,000 years of Christianity and progressivism is the only possible outcome. I wouldn't even say that's the case with Protestantism. I just think there's certain things say that are a result of Protestantism. I wouldn't say that this is the only possible result of it. But I don't know. It's just like the idea that like any of this stuff is inherent to Christianity just seems insane, because the only civilization they can be harkening back to is like, I don't know, when Vikings were living in when like the ancestors of Vikings were living in huts like 3,000 years ago. Wow, cool. That's a great civilization you have. I don't know. It's just stupid. I don't care about these people. I don't really care enough to even really work out a good response to them. They're just irrelevant. I guess to something related to this is I think what's very important to understand on the right is not everyone has to be a Christian, but everyone has to understand that Christianity is the core of the right. If you're an atheist, or even if you're a cringe pagan or whatever, that's cool. You can keep your personal views to yourself, but you need to recognize that the core of the movement, both in terms of numbers and in terms of ideology, is Christian. And if you have a problem with that, then you just can't hang out here.
And I think that for a large part, that's correct. I do think that we do want to have people on board. There is a need to appeal, but we are appealing to something specific. That's why the opposition to the left exists. We're not just people who happen to be fed up with the current system. It's for a very particular reason, and a lot of that is, of course, informed by Christianity. And like you said, I'm not here to throw a bunch of people overboard. I'm certainly new to this, and I'm not here to police this kind of thing. But I think if you're honest, you need to understand that while even if you are not personally on board with Christianity, understand that this is quite a bit of where this is going to come from and what's going to inform these worldviews. And you need to understand that I don't think there's a real chance. I see people say this all the time on like Twitter, and it just blows my mind. They're like, "We'll just start a new religion. We'll just start the new based religion," and I just don't understand how they think they're going to get there. I think that the vast majority of the reaction to this stuff will be based out of more traditional Christianity, and I think that's going to be essential going forward. And so I think now we could probably talk a little bit of what we hinted about before. One of the things that I think is really the kickback we're seeing right now in the culture is, of course, what got published on Netflix with the Cuties movie and just the overt sexualization of prepubescent girls. This is causing something that I think is, of course, very fundamental. A lot of people who aren't Christians see this, and it's incredibly disturbing to them. They get a visceral reaction against it. But without that, I think, framework, they have a hard time explaining what's wrong with it. And so I think, the more that progressivism expose itself to some very naturally abhorrent stuff, I think people will be looking for a better explanation than like consent as to why this kind of thing is wrong. And that's where the right needs to have the understanding that that's not just a competing worldview. There is a religious subtext going on there.
Yeah, I mean, like I wouldn't even push back a bit to what you said there, previously about like the pagan stuff or atheists or whatever. Like I just do not care about these people. Having a successful movement is not about having the most numbers possible. Quality control is essential to any successful movement, and the cringe internet pagan larpers are one of the people that need to be kicked out. I mean, like I said, if they can be polite, if they can keep this in their free time, if they can understand that they're subservient to a Christian movement, okay, cool, whatever. Then I don't really care what your personal opinions on those matters are. But if you're going to be talking about how Christianity is some sort of 2,000-year plot to have drag queen story hour, then you're just stupid, and I have no desire in having you associated with me in any way. It's like, I mean, like I've been saying, this is a fundamentally religious worldview. This is a fundamentally religious conflict. If you have people that say that try to pretend they're on our side, but say our religion sucks, sorry, you're out.
Sure, absolutely. No, I'm in agreement with that 100%. Now, thought it would be interesting to also maybe talk about, a lot of times, of course, we talk about Moldbug or other people who aren't exactly super faith-based but have excellent political analysis. But I think it might be interesting to talk about what authors have you read that you feel kind of moved you from the religious and spiritual side towards also a more reactionary idea of politics?
You mean at the same time? I don't know. I mean, I guess St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas are like probably the two main examples. Chesterton too a bit. Who else? Yeah, I mean, I guess those would be like the three main ones I can think off the top of my head.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, De Maistre too, of course. I haven't read tons of his stuff, but he's really good.
Yeah, I actually really like De Maistre a lot. I started reading his stuff a couple months ago, and I'm big fan of that. And of course, Aquinas and Augustine would be big. Chesterton's going to be, I think, key. And then me, personally, not I guess so much reactionary, but of course C.S. Lewis was a very big part of me growing as a person, and I think spiritually as well. I was wondering, have you read Patrick Deneen at all? Have you had a chance to read Why Liberalism Failed?
No, I haven't gotten around to that. I have a huge reading list stuff I'm trying to get to.
Oh no, I totally understand. I'm in the same scenario. I keep hearing about all these different essential books, and I'm trying to get to them as fast as possible. But with life and everything else that's going on right now, I think it can be very difficult. But I think if you are interested, I think Patrick Deneen, especially being a Catholic, I think that would be an excellent book you might find really interesting, because I think Patrick Deneen probably made the best argument against liberalism from a moral situation that I've read. Obviously, guys like Moldbug will give you a good one from the purely political, but I think he does a great job of doing it from the moral side as well.
Yeah, I'll have to check it out.
Absolutely. Well, another thing that I thought would be interesting. Right now, we're just getting school back, and I noticed that during the pandemic, we had a large amount of people from the right who were pushing really, really hard to get kids back in school. It was like very essential to get kids back in school, and I thought that was a really obvious blunder from the right, because I felt like COVID was it's obviously terrible in many ways, but the one way it was a gift was it was forcing a lot of people to have to explore homeschooling or other alternatives. And I understand the want to like own the libs on every level, but just the push to get kids back into public schools, places where conservatives repeatedly tell people there is this terrible indoctrination happening, which is absolutely true. I just thought it was interesting that we saw such a push from especially the talk radio right to like get these things back open and get kids back into those public schools and back into that progressive religious indoctrination.
Yeah. I agree. It's interesting because I do understand the issue that conservatives are having. There's lots of people, there's lots of working families out there that having kids home all the time is just not something that they've organized their lives around. And this is really this is really difficult for them to have to deal with. So it's not just baseless why they want the schools to reopen and stuff. But I mean, ultimately, if you don't have the ability to homeschool your kids or send them to a good private school or whatever, you really you really need to at least educate them separately in addition to your public schooling, because you can't just take them to church every Sunday and assume that they're going to end up being they're going to end up being like good Christians or good conservatives or whatever. The amount of indoctrination they get is insane, and we need to be able to work parallel to these types of things. Many such cases. I've seen many people come from relatively good homes with parents who thought they're doing everything right, only for the kids to turn out to be crazy at the end of the day because of all the indoctrination they got. But I get the issue is just like I said, that there's a lot of people that just aren't prepared for this. But it should be an opportunity. It should be something that, when's a better time than now? So yeah, one person that actually has been making basically that same point recently. I know people are going to say he's cringe, but this is something I really hate from the right, where we always complain when you have moderate conservatives that disavow us because we said something that some left-winger says is racist. But then we constantly disavow people that are like center-right, even if they say something interesting. So I really hate that mentality. I'm not saying that we should like just embrace entirely all the like Daily Wire people or whatever. But when they say something interesting, when they say something good, I think there's nothing wrong with recognizing that and like lauding that or whatever. So what I was going to bring up is Matt Walsh has been making a lot of interesting points recently in the past couple of months, and he's been talking about this, how we shouldn't be wanting to go back to school. So yeah, and I know people are going to say he's like cringe, and yeah, he is in a lot of ways, but I don't think we should obsess about that too much.
No, I agree 100%. In fact, that's probably the thing I hate the most, and I get it. Like when the talk radio right says something that is ridiculous, when they say something that is keeping people from moving forward and understanding what's really going on. But I totally get it. Like we should be pushing back against that. We should be deriding that. But when they do like make a journey, when they do make good points, when they do start moving a certain direction, and I think Matt Walsh is probably the best example of that I can think of in recent memory. While Matt Walsh, yes, absolutely has a history of he's certainly not a guy who is shy about condemning people to his right and making mistakes like that. He has come out very aggressively and tweeted some things. Honestly, I didn't think the Daily Wire would be keeping him around with some of the stuff he's been saying recently, not just, of course, about schools like you're saying, but with the violence that's been going on with the riots, with the violence against and racial preferences. Like he's been saying stuff that I really did not expect anyone in the mainstream right to address in a way that I didn't expect them to address. And so when that happens, I'm 100% on board with embracing the positive points being made by people like that. I totally agree. Yeah, and I think to continue on with a little bit of the public school stuff, like I think people need to understand that public school has always, of course, been a tool of who's ever in charge, for right or for wrong, to be indoctrinating the children into the culture that they want. But I think people need to understand how hands-on the public school is with your kids now. You have to understand. I'm pretty involved in public education, and you have to understand that the kids that are coming into the classroom today are largely almost entirely unchurched. Like they might as well have been from a uncontacted tribe in South America or something. Like they have no concept of the Bible. They have no contact with Christianity beyond random, things thrown in, references in their pop culture that might vaguely be floating around and existing. There's no value of understanding of sacrifice or defense of culture or defense of homeland. None of this is valued, and so a large number of public schools are now adopting literally morality education. Like they're like, we have to teach these kids like that you can't just punch someone you don't like, and you can't just like spit on adults that are in charge of you, and you can't just like hate everyone because you feel like it. Just very basic things like this. But of course, because this is entirely progressive, along with that comes everything else you would imagine. It's all the demasculization. It's all the it's all the LGBT stuff. It's all the stuff that you would expect coming right in with all of this theoretical morality education.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's not something I'm incredibly familiar with. I mean, I know growing up when I was in high school and stuff, I'd hear like my progressive teachers talk about how we're like a like bigoted Christian majority country, and it's like, I don't know, there was probably a dozen people that were in any way seriously religious Christians in the entire school. And I mean, I'm sure it has something to do with the area I'm not saying that all schools are quite as extreme. But yeah, I don't know. It's just we're just in such an awful state.
Well, what do you think about the state of kind of the awareness of religious communities? I obviously you're working up in Canada. I'm down in the U.S. But when it comes to religious communities, what's the sense that you get that they understand maybe kind of what's going on around them? Like I obviously don't expect them to be to have read all of unqualified reservations or anything, but do you feel a shift in the religious community, awareness of how things might have accelerated and what role they might be taking beyond kind of where the church has been recently in the culture?
I mean, I'm not really sure what you're asking.
Well, I guess I just didn't know. Do you feel like there are more conversations about where things might be going politically in the future of Christianity in that sphere inside the church? Obviously, this is not going to be in a healthy church. This is not going to be the majority of what they're talking about. But I just didn't know in your day-to-day interactions with people in your faith if that's something you've noticed.
I don't know, not really. One of the things that sort of made me fed up with like evangelical Christianity when I was one of those was that the sort of churches I was going to, they were all like moderately theologically conservative churches. They certainly weren't liberal in the ways that you'd generally think of. But they all were like, they all seemed really wishy-washy. And I went to a fair number of them when I was looking for a church to go to. So it's not like this was just one or two. But I mean, when I was going to different churches, I remember to find a decent one to go to. I remember one I showed up and the entire sermon was about refugees. And the one that I ended up settling on was it was a relatively good church. I'm not saying it was really bad or anything, but I went there for about 3 years. And it wasn't super liberal or anything. But it was like for the 3 years I was there, the only social issue they ever really talked about was pornography, which is good. I mean, they talk about pornography a fair bit, and pornography is a very serious issue. So that's fine. But it's like for the entire time there, I don't even remember them ever talking about like premarital sex, and certainly they never talked about like the LGBT stuff at all. And yeah, I just remember, and they also never talked about abortion. Actually, I remember they did once talk about abortion and the LGBT stuff. That's when they had a guest pastor once because the regular pastor was on vacation or something. I can't remember exactly, but the regular pastor wasn't there. So they had a guest pastor And he ended his sermon by saying that Christians shouldn't be so worried about Christians shouldn't be so worried about like LGBT stuff or abortion. They should, or he didn't even just say that. He put in like the worst possible light. He said the Christians shouldn't be like screaming at women that are having abortions or protesting people for putting up a gay pride flag. They should just be worried about spreading the gospel. So he like strawmanned it in the worst way possible. And I mean, that was a guest pastor, so maybe they just didn't realize that he would say something that bad when they invited him. But it's, I mean, again, that's like a moderately conservative church I went to. It's a sort of a church that I remember one of my professors once referring to that particular denomination and said and mentioning that like, oh, this is one of the like scary ultra conservative denominations. And I didn't mention that I was a part of that one at that time, but I just remember thinking like it's as milquetoast as I could possibly imagine it being without just being liberal. So yeah, I mean, I don't know, like I said, my personal experiences with these things are somewhat limited. And I'm certainly not saying that Catholics are in a much greater position. I mean, the current church I'm in is certainly better than any of those churches. The Catholic church I go to, they do talk about abortion and euthanasia and stuff relatively frequently. So they at least kind of talk about the stuff, but even still, I mean, okay, yeah, they talk about it, but are they really doing that much? I mean, yeah, they have done a few things, but none of them really realize how bad of a situation we're in is sort of the biggest problem.
Yeah, and I think you're right that's infecting, unfortunately, more churches across the board. I think it often, even if it's not a doctrinal issue, like we did say, what was was it a Catholic church where they were doing the SJW affirmation chant about supporting Black Lives Matter and that kind of thing that went around on Twitter.
Yeah, that was
week. Yeah. So unfortunately, you might have some more resistance due to the structure of the Catholic Church. Obviously, it's not just a Protestant problem, but I think often with the Protestants, as I'm a member of one of the more based Protestant sects, and I think often the focus is on bringing people in is the key, and if you can just get them in the pew, everything else will follow. And a lot of times they think that they're curtailing their language in order to help people get into that situation, and they don't realize that is its own problem in and of itself. But I think what's also interesting is I think largely the religious right politically has been kind of a disaster with the takes it's taken. Of course, my ongoing just every time I see David French tweet, I don't follow him, but every once in a while, like something gets liked or retweeted, and I just like, not again. Like just having to see that stance of constant retreat and never seeming to understand what's actually going on in the political sphere and how their adherence to liberalism has more or less made it impossible for them to actually defend the tenets of Christianity. But I am seeing more and more people step in, and honestly, from the Catholic sphere, guys like Adrian Vermeule and is it Sarim Sahari? I'm sorry, I always get his name wrong. But some guys are stepping up and starting to talk more about like, no guys, we can't actually just hands off all this stuff. Like, you will continue to get cuties, we will continue to get this kind of filth, and the marketplace of ideas is not going to solve this problem. So I do think there are some people making an effort, but do you think that we're capable of seeing a shift in that direction, or do you think that's a long-term project, or do you think we just have to work outside of that because we're not going to see that from the mainstream Christian representation in kind of GOP right-wing circles?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not really sure, to be honest. I know that's not a very helpful answer.
No, that's okay. No, it's honest enough. One other thing I was wondering about is, obviously, I'm more familiar with the American situation, and we talk a lot about the American situation because it bleeds over into everyone else. America catches a cold and everybody else, or America sneezes, everybody else catches a cold. And so it's so much of the political battle that's happening in other countries does end up getting represented in America. But I was wondering, with kind of the Canadian situation, what is, obviously we have a lot of violence happening here in America right now. We have the riots and everything going on. Is there anything reflective of that in Canada, or is the general disposition of Canada avoid that, the makeup of Canada avoid that? What are things like, tension wise when it comes to political sides in Canada right now?
I mean, I don't know. The Conservative Party is just awful. It's just totally submitted to the left on all social issues. So I don't know that there are. I mean, I guess they I guess with the sort of statue toppling stuff, it is much less advanced in Canada. Like even the Liberal Party has been kind of hasn't really supported taking down much statues. I mean, there has been some of this stuff happening at the municipal level, but that's about it. And that is like the one sort of social issue the Conservatives are running on is preventing the total destruction of Canadian history. But that's about it. The sort of political situation in Canada is really bad. There's just incredibly little resistance.
Well, I was wondering, with the continued, obviously the continued difficulty of growing, some of these religious communities in person, just due to the distance that's involved with some of the people who would maybe share kind of the worldview we're talking about, the outlook that we're talking about. Do you think there's a growing chance of people putting things together either digitally or in real life through these circles? I know you run a pretty active Discord server. Do you feel like that's a promising outlet? I know it's never going to replace real, true religious communities in person, but do you feel like that's an outlet that might be available to people?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how useful Discord is. It certainly requires a lot of moderation to ensure that it doesn't get banned. But yeah, I mean, I do think that I do think that sort of as the situation continues to get worse, that sort of parallelism is just going to be necessary, because our only options are going to be submit to them entirely, or trying to live outside of the progressive mainstream. And many, probably most, will submit. But though there have been many social changes people have submitted to thus far, I think there's some things that are just so far that some people are going to have to try to resist it in whatever ways they can.
No, absolutely, and I think if nothing else, you have something of a support system. That's one of the things that I think the right has to do better. Is it needs to find a way to to catch people when they're falling, when they need some kind of you can't really build a community. I love memes as much as everybody else, but a bunch of anonymous people sending out memes doesn't really build in the way I think you're eventually going to need. So guys, if you have any questions, if you're interested in asking any questions, you can go ahead and throw those in chat. I'll keep an eye out for those. They don't have to be on the topic. If you want to ask anything about a recent video from Settlers or from me, or another topic, you can throw that in there. But one thing I did want to talk to you before we left is you did talk about, you had an interesting video, and it's funny because I had already suggested this topic to you before you had your video come out, I think yesterday. But do you want to talk a little bit about the video you put out yesterday? I think you had an interesting take on kind of Andrew Klavan from the Daily Wire, and how he was using Christianity and how that sometimes gets used by people, especially in the political sphere on the right.
Yeah, I know it was just about the sort of famous "Judge Not" verse, and how that is so abused. It just clear. I mean, I know. I mean, I'm Catholic, so I don't think you can just go to the Bible and discover everything by just reading it. But this is one of those verses where, like, just you and your Bible and the Holy Spirit seems to be enough. It seems pretty clear to me by just reading Matthew 7, was it? I think I don't know. It doesn't matter. But the Judge Not verse. It just like if you read the whole passage, it seems pretty clear what's going on there. And the reinterpretation of it to mean that you can never identify that anyone is ever doing anything bad. It just is obviously ridiculous and obviously flies in the face of everything that happens throughout the entire Bible. I mean, no one could possibly live up to this standard anywhere even close. I mean, I know, what someone might say is, well, there's many things in Christianity that no one but Christ himself can live up to. But I mean, for one, Christ did not live up to this standard, so this could not possibly be the standard that is being set. Um, but I mean, even beyond this, like all Andrew Clavin does for a living is judging people, and there's nothing wrong with that. Like I'm not saying he's even particularly judgmental, but that's his job, is like identifying bad things that left wingers do, essentially. And it just, I don't know. I mean, I know his son is gay, so I don't know if that's like the reason he's so liberal about it. I know he's denied that before, that he said that this is just what he's always believed, and that may be true. He's he's from like progressive communities. He's been he's been around sort of socially progressive people his entire life, so maybe that's just the reason. But it just, I don't know. This sort of reinterpretation of the gospel, which is very common, it just seems blatantly wrong.
No, absolutely, and I do think you're right about Clavin. He is a guy who came out of, he's a fiction writer and a film writer, and came out of incredibly progressive circles. So he may have gone as far as he can go for a little while on that journey morally, especially like you said with his son, who I followed on Twitter and has some interesting discussions. But yeah, I do think that might impact some of that. You might be right about that. Looking at some of the questions from chat, we have a Canadian specific question. What is your favorite maple syrup? I don't know if that's considered bigoted.
I don't really consume much maple syrup.
Yeah, just shattering the stereotype and for everyone here. So asking a recent video about the woke eating the progressives alive. What do you think will be the changes in governance as a result of this? So yeah, guys, the last video I made was kind of about how I think we're seeing I think everybody knows the woke kind of the aggressive woke parts of the party are taking over. There's nothing new about that. But I think what we are seeing is a shift away from the dependence on, kind of the prosperity of modernity, the efficiency of progressivism, how it works and interacts with current technology. And we're instead seeing them move back to kind of the more religious aspect of progressivism, focusing more on of course, the identity politics and all the things that were always there. It's not like these things didn't exist in progressivism, but they're being brought to the forefront because increasingly, I think we're finding that those aspects of progressivism that made it successful in the spreadsheet era don't really make it a very good way to activate people's religious instinct. I think this will change governance, and I think it will change governance in all the ways you'd expect. I think you're going to have less of a focus on GDP. I think you're going to have less of a focus on efficiency. I think you're going to have less of a focus on kind of the things that we think of as the more neoliberal tradition. And we're going to see much more of a focus on the more tribal aspects. You're going to see a pushing of increasingly, and you're already seeing, I'm not telling you guys probably anything you don't know, but you're going to see more and more of the governance turn towards those policies. You're going to see a magnification of those racial preferences, those sexual preference, those things that have already been encoded to law. Those are going to become even more so. We're going to see more restrictions on people who would oppose that. They're going to be more open about them. They've been doing them quietly through choices on prosecution and Supreme Court rulings and enforcements. But I think we'll start seeing more of that get substantiated. This is why I think we're seeing things like the attempt to repeal bans on discrimination in college admissions in California, because the left is planning to go full bore with this stuff, and we're not going to see them even hinting otherwise. Let's see. Do you think LS hormone this transition be? I don't think I'm super familiar with that. Sorry.
That I'm pretty sure that's an insult.
Okay. Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, I didn't quite understand what he was trying to say there. Wars on faith. I don't know if you have any thoughts on this one. Settler wars of faith in European wars. Do you feel like they really were more about faith, or do you think they were just the ambition of secular monarchs? Do you have any thoughts on that? And I mean, obviously
Yeah,
that's pretty general, but
yeah. I don't know. This is just like a stupid left-wing talking point. Were they very deeply about faith? Yeah. I mean, were there like secular political motives in like conflate with that too? Yeah. I mean, but both of those are true. Like I don't know the idea that like religion causes tons of wars and stuff. I mean, the way we've already defined religion, like if we accept that religion and intellectual tradition are essentially synonyms, then this entire discussion is just meaningless. But even if we're only talking about traditional religions, then this discussion is still very this discussion is still very stupid because the best example of this is just the 20th century. No reasonable person could possibly say most of the major wars of the 20th century had anything to do with religion. I know you will see insane leftists occasionally that will say that leftist atheists that will say that they were secretly about religion some way, but they're just stupid and there's no reason to like. There's no what they'll say something stupid like Hitler was a Christian. He was not a Christian, by the way. That's like entirely made up. Anyone that says that and Hitler started war, therefore Christianity started World War II. It's just stupid stuff like that. There's no way you could possibly say either World War I or II was in any way primarily religious. And if we accept that, then we're saying that the most destructive wars of human history were not religious. So I don't know what is any of this supposed to be saying. It's just a cringe left talking point.
okay. And another one from Aurelian Imperator. What do you have any books on Catholicism you recommend? Obviously, we already talked about Augustine, and we already talked about Chesterton. But do you have any other books specifically on Catholicism that you found interesting or helpful?
Yeah, I mean the difficulty with this question is there's like a million different books I could suggest, and it really depends where you're at. The two books that I recommend to people if they're like interested but they don't know a lot is always both from Trent Horn. He's an apologist from Catholic Answers. I think he's really good. Those two books would be Why We're Catholic and The Case for Catholicism. They're both very entry level, so I'm not like expecting you to go there and think that these are like insane arguments you've never heard of before. But if you're not super familiar with this stuff, if you haven't read a lot of it already, if you want a good introduction, I'd say those two books are the best place to start. The Why We're Catholic, which is just sort of a basic introduction to like everything, all the main things Catholics believe, and The Case for Catholicism, which is a sort of refutation of most of the main Protestant arguments. That second one is particularly good. The first one's much more entry level. The second one is still pretty entry level, but it's a bit more in depth. Particularly what's really good about Trent Horn is his knowledge of Protestant apologists, and what they say is very extensive. I don't know many popular apologists who are able to just like quote a million different people from the opposing side as well as he is. So I mean, those would be the two main books I'd suggest just to get started if you're not very familiar with this stuff. I mean, the Bible, obviously. Other than that, if you want something, the Summa Theologica is very good. And I mean, the Summa, for people that are unfamiliar with it, the Summa isn't something to just read back to front. Just like look through the index of it, look at all the different articles, and just pick out things that you think are interesting. It's very long. I mean, anything by St. Augustine, City of God, or City of God, or the Confessions are both very good. And I mean, I like that. I have a big like book list. I have a bunch of books on Mary from when I was converting myself. It's just, and I mean, those are all pretty good books, but if you're not specifically looking for something on that or something on many of the other topics, I don't think it's very useful to just rattle off a bunch more books. If you need any more specific book recommendations, feel free to PM me on like Twitter or Discord or something. So those would be my main ones to get started with.
Absolutely. Well, thanks, guys. I think we're going to probably go ahead and wrap it up. We are coming up on an hour, but I want to thank everybody for stopping by. We had some great chat going on. I also appreciate Settlers coming on. Obviously, I think everybody here is probably subscribed, but if you need any of his links, they are in the description down below. But yeah, Settlers, thank again for coming on. It was a great chat.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for having me.
All right, guys, thanks for stopping by, and once again, have a good one. We'll talk to you next time.